This is a Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia teach-in at the University of Michigan on the war in Ukraine. My name is Geneviève Zubrzycki. I'm professor of sociology and director of WCEE. I'll be moderating the teach-in. We'll have a new specialist every half hour. They will speak for 15 to 20 minutes. The shorter they speak, the more time there is for your questions and for discussion. We prioritize questions from students because the teaching is primarily addressed to them. And you can use at any time during the event the chat button to pose your question, or you can use the raise your hand button also and pose your question directly live. We ask that you are brief in your question, and we ask respondents to be brief in their response and also to remain respectful at all times. And now I would like to introduce our next speaker. We're honored to have with us Ambassador Daniel Fried, who is the Weiser Family Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council. During his 40-year Foreign Service career, Ambassador Fried played a key role in designing and implementing American policy in Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union. As a special assistant and NSC senior director for Presidents Clinton and Bush, ambassador to Poland and Assistant Secretary of State for Europe between 2005 and 2009, Ambassador Fried crafted the policy of NATO enlargement to Central European nations and, in parallel, shaping NATO-Russia relations. Ambassador Fried also helped lead the West's response to Moscow's aggression against Ukraine in 2014, and he will be speaking to us about Ukraine being stuck in the middle, Ukraine and US diplomacy in Eastern Europe before Putin's war. Ambassador Fried, welcome.
Thank you for having me. Great to be here. I'm sorry that I missed Ron Sunni's remarks, but I did catch some of them. Putin's attack on Ukraine does put us into the territory of Stalin and Hitler's aggression in Europe. That is a comparison I have always resisted making. But it is sadly apt. It is sadly apt. Putin's attack on Ukraine in its origins and the bad excuses he gave has striking parallels with the German rationale for attacking Poland, right down to the accusations of atrocities against the supposed atrocities against the co-nationals of the aggressor nation. The parallel with Hitler's attack on Poland ends, however, because that attack, designed as a blitzkrieg, was actually successful, although the Poles resisted far more successfully than is recounted in many of the history textbooks. German casualties in that campaign, 1 month of fighting, were 17,000 killed in action. However, there's a second historical parallel which comes to mind, and that is Stalin's Winter War against Finland. Stalin, in December 1939, partly pursuant to his alliance with Hitler, goes after Finland, and he expects to be liberated. He expects his armies to be greeted as liberators by the so-called oppressed Finnish masses, and Stalin even as a communist government waiting in the wings. Well, you probably know what happened. The Finns absolutely mauled his initial assaults. The Soviets then pulled back, regrouped, and started pounding the Finns, who had to sue for peace. They lost some territory. They lost their fourth largest city. But they saved their country, and Stalin put aside permanently his attempts to communize the country. There's a third historic analogy, the least probable in my mind, which is 1905. The Tsar, facing all kinds of domestic stresses, decides to have a short, glorious, victorious war. He picks Japan. The Japanese beat him badly, beat the Tsar's navy in particular rather badly, and a revolution breaks out in Russia. Not the Bolshevik revolution, but a mass revolution and a problem. So which historical parallel is most apt? Well, none of them is perfect. None of them is perfect. I thought when the campaign started, we were deep in the September 1939 campaign against Poland. Now it looks like we're sort of in something that recalls Stalin's Winter War against Finland. There is a minority view held by some of my friends who are studying the difficulties that the Russians find themselves in, but a view I do not yet share, that the difficulties the Russians now find the military difficulties the Russians are now having are not simply going to be causes or obstacles, and that the Russians may actually fail to win. I didn't say lose as in the Ukrainians beat them and send them back to the Russian border, but there is a significant, though in my view, minority chance that the Russian offensives could fail, that they will be unable to hold the territory they've taken, particularly in the south, and that their offensive on Kiev will simply not succeed. Now, I think it's somewhat more likely that it will succeed, and there will be massive deaths, and the cities will be surrounded. I don't know where this ends. Will it end with Putin annexing large areas of southern Ukraine, the so-called Novorossiya? That is basically taking a swath of Ukrainian territory from the breakaway, the separatist puppet states, all the way perhaps to Odessa, or at least to Crimea, in which case Ukraine could lose access to the sea, but there could be a kind of Western Ukraine and a either Soviet-dominated Ukrainian state, sort of the equivalent of East Germany, or Putin just annexes the territory. In either case, he will have difficulty holding on to it. We are deep into these kinds of considerations. This is a full-scale land war in Europe. Moreover, is taking his country back deep into Soviet territory. I've already described the parallels with Stalin. The degree of political repression and the crushing of the last remnants of independent media in Russia take us back to Soviet eras of isolation, political repression, media control. Putin is disconnecting Russia from the internet piece by piece. Moreover, he is also reestablishing some of the fundamentals of Soviet economics. I can talk about the sanctions the West imposed, but let's say that they are so powerful, they surprised even me. That is, I didn't see the central bank sanction as likely this quickly. But the Russian reaction, Putin's reaction to these sanctions, particularly the locking down of Russia's foreign exchange reserves, has been to impose Soviet-style capital controls. And he is moving, not quite there yet, but moving toward ending the convertibility of the ruble. He's now imposing restrictions. Ending the convertibility of the ruble sounds like a technical financial economist's thing. It's not. What that does, and people my age who remember the Soviet Union will know what I'm talking about, ending the convertibility of the ruble creates a black market for dollars and euros and pounds. And it creates a black market for the things that dollars and euros and pounds can buy. It means that the politically connected will have more access to these things and other people will not. This was a hallmark. This was a feature of Soviet economics. Putin has threatened to nationalize the assets of companies that have left Russia. Well, good luck with that. You can nationalize the Apple stores in Moscow, but you will not create Apple products. Today, TASS reports that Putin said that the Soviet Union always had to deal with sanctions and was successful. Okay, think about that. The Soviet Union was successful. Well, search me, but as far as I know, the Soviet Union no longer exists. It fell apart. And it fell apart after it had failed politically and in the world and economically. And that failure was so profound, the collapse of the Soviet Union also meant the retreat of Russia's borders in Europe to their mid and early 17th century extent, meaning the loss of Ukraine. Hence, the trauma of in Russian history that Putin seems so consumed by. What he is doing, if I was, into psychological profiles of leaders, what he seems to be doing is trying to take Russia back to Soviet days in the hopes that he can make it come out different this time. Unlikely. But the war is going most likely to intensify. And there could be far, far more deaths of civilians, by orders of magnitude more. If Putin's armies do succeed in surrounding Kyiv. There probably aren't 3 million people left in the city, but there probably, if a third have left, there's still 2 million people. Some will get out before the city is closed. How many will remain? You're talking about World War II levels of civilian deaths. That's on Putin. We, the West, are not going back to another reset. I don't know where this ends. Much depends on the fortunes in the battlefield. There will be a prolonged Ukrainian resistance, possibly a free Ukrainian state and a puppet state, or a smaller free Ukrainian state, and a resistance inside the Russian-occupied areas. You're talking about a prolonged period of economic and political hostility. Europeans have reacted emotionally to this in ways that surprise them, certainly surprised me. They're seeing images that remind them of World War II. The Germans, there are still some Germans who are talking about, rather fatuously, that there is only a diplomatic solution. Well, Putin thinks there's a military solution. In any event, ugly business. I've gone on too long, and Pani Zubrzycki, please tell me what would you like, where would you like me to take it? And I'm happy to answer questions and stay with you as long as you like.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Fried, for this analysis and reflections. It's very scary. So perhaps one question, a follow-up question would be, where did diplomacy fail? You've been working in that field for 40 years, as I mentioned. And now there seems to be, we've crossed a line. We're not going to be able to walk it back, it looks like. So what can be done at this point from a diplomatic point of view?
Well, you've asked two questions, both of which are perfectly reasonable. How did we fail to prevent the war? Now, I went through I was Assistant Secretary of State for Europe in the run-up to the Russo-Georgian War in August 2008. And we were in a very different place then. Neither the US nor Europe were prepared for the war. There were some of us, myself included, who were sort of shouting from the rooftops that war was coming. And Condi Rice, who was Secretary of State then, mostly believed me, but the US government and the intelligence community didn't believe it was happening. They didn't believe it was coming. And the war came. This time, the Biden administration absolutely nailed it. They said the war was coming. They warned everybody the war was coming. They rallied the Europeans. They did everything that we failed to do in the run-up to the US, to the Russo-Georgian War in 2008. They prepared sanctions that we didn't even contemplate. They talked about reinforcing NATO's eastern flank. So they were as prepared in this time as we were unprepared in 2008. And yet the war came, which leads to suspicion that the chief variable is not our response. It's on Putin. He wanted this war. There's this, minor key myth that the Georgians, that Putin successfully provoked Saakashvili in 2008, who Georgian villages were being shelled, and Saakashvili went after the Russian and the Russian troops in South Ossetia and their allies, and therefore he gave Putin an excuse to attack. Well, this time the Ukrainians didn't fall for any Russian provocation, and Putin attacked anyway. You see my point, that Putin wanted this war. He was going to get his war. Saakashvili provided him an excuse, and he went in. Zelensky did not provide any excuse, and Putin went in. He wanted his war. I'm sure that there will be questions asked about, and even an examination of whether Biden, instead of saying explicitly in advance that the United States would not intervene militarily, that we would reserve our military intervention for NATO countries, but not for Ukraine, which is not part of NATO, that somehow we gave Putin a green light. I bet that will come out. But I'm not going to criticize Biden for this. Had he said that the United States would intervene militarily, there would have been an outcry of people who said, no, that is provocative. So, that answers half your question. I could go on, but I know there are a whole bunch of questions. I'm in your hands.
Yes, so I will ask one brief, because you just addressed President Biden's response to the conflict. So one question is, why hasn't he called for a ceasefire?
Biden?
Yes, that's a
I
question.
think we've called for this. We have been shouting, the administration's been shouting about this for a long time. I don't think that's, we've been insisting that Putin stop. I don't think it would, I think, doing so more frequently would probably not get us very much.
Okay, we have a question, thank you, by Will Kuhn, who's a undergraduate student at the Ford School of Public Policy. Will, your floor is yours. And I encourage other students to be brave and ask questions. This event is for you. So please, if you don't want to pose your question directly, put it in the chat, and you might want to mark that you're a student so that we ask yours first. Will?
Great to see you again, Ambassador Freed. And also agree with your remark with McFall on Twitter. It was, this is not about our theory at the end of the day. It's actually about actual people's lives. At Ray Mearsheimer. So anyways, my question is on the shortcoming of the Russian doctrine, because as you've seen, they've been performing very poorly, and partially due to the muddy weather. Their T-80s, T-90s have not been using the terrains. Would you say that this military doctrine has been sort of been defeated in a way where they've sort of abandoned it in this setting? Or do you think that the Stinger missile and the Javelin missiles have been playing a large role in thwarting their aggression in Ukraine in a sense? Why are they performing so poorly?
Well, why are the Russians performing so poorly? They came in with faulty assumptions, just as Stalin did in 1939 when he attacked Finland. They believed their own rhetoric that the Ukrainians were pro-Russian and simply being dominated by a fascist US-installed clique in Kyiv. They apparently really believe that. Secondly, the US had the intelligence in the run-up to the war just spot on.
Oh, you're muted.
Okay, yes, the
you're
host
back.
muted me. I don't know why. The intelligence in the run-up to the war was as good as the intelligence in the run-up to the Iraq war was bad. However, the US military calculations of how the war would unfold were off by a lot. We overestimated the Russian military. We thought its reforms after its mixed performance in the Russo-Georgian War had been impressive. In fact, Putin runs a kleptocracy. Everybody steals from top to bottom. That is not a bug of the system. That is a feature of the system. So it looks like the Russian army had been drained. Poor maintenance, bad logistics. Everybody takes their cut until there wasn't a lot left for the soldiers. They still are advancing. I don't want to overstate this or suggest that their army is about to collapse. There's some say it is. I'm not convinced. US weapon supplies to the Ukrainians make a lot of difference. We know from the Russo-Georgian War that the Russians had no problem defeating the Georgians easily when the Georgians were using Soviet-era weapons. But when the Georgians had Israeli or US weapons, the Russians suffered a lot of casualties. Now, I thought that the Russians would have addressed this problem in the intervening years, but looks like they didn't. And so they have trouble dealing with Western weapons. They still have the they still have the larger army. We don't know the way this war is going to end. But that's quite an astonishing statement to make, that you don't know how it will go between Russia and Ukraine. Doesn't say much for the Russian military. They could still win, though, killing a lot of people.
A question by Roman Rewald, who's asking if Russian society is ultimately, suffering from repression by Putin's terror. And what do you see the role for the US and other allies to support civil society in Russia at this point?
Oh, man, what a good question. Any long-term policy toward Putin's Russia has to include a rather important element of outreach to Russian civil society. Very difficult under current circumstances, but if we managed in the Soviet days to penetrate Soviet propaganda, we can probably figure out a way to do so this time. It's always hard. A lot of people still apparently support Putin's war. There are a lot of stories about Ukrainians with Russian relatives contacting their Russian relatives who think that what's happening is not happening. Like Ukrainians saying, the Russians are shelling us, and their relatives in Russia saying, no, that's not possible. We wouldn't do that. So there's a lot of work to be done. But Roman, we know from the Soviet period that the Kremlin has the advantage in the short term, but not necessarily the long term. There's also an interesting question as to how young people in Moscow, St. Petersburg, other cities will react, because they've been living interconnected, modern, technologically online lives. and it's been taken away from them in about 2 weeks. They going to accept the rather nasty nationalist propaganda line coming from the Kremlin? Maybe not so much when the economy starts spiraling down as it is already doing. But that is a challenge. Roman, your challenge is for all of us looking into the future.
And I think that Yevgeny Albat's journalist will be talking a bit about these issues of civil society and what's going on in Russia and the lack of independent media or the repression of independent media. So in a few minutes, she will join us.
She's great.
She's wonderful. We hosted her. She was a WCEE distinguished fellow. So she was with us for a full year, the year COVID broke out. So we're eager to welcome her. But before we do so, I would like to pose one last question by a student, McKeithen Robertson, who's asking also an important question, I think, about Belarus. So what does, in your opinion, what has this invasion of Ukraine taught us about Belarus? Are we seeing the beginning of Belarus becoming a vassal state of Russia? And what should we make of Lukashenko's claim that this is not the case?
Well, you're not seeing the beginning of Belarus being a vassal state. You're seeing it becoming a vassal state. This was a result of Lukashenko relying on Russia for the security to keep his regime in power. Lukashenko had always been rather adept at just showing the West just enough liberalization. That is, he'd release a few political prisoners and then the West would lighten up on him because we wanted an independent Belarus, even under Lukashenko, as something preferable to a Belarus under Putin. But with his stolen elections and a mass opposition movement, Lukashenko was in serious trouble, so he relied on Putin to save him. And having done so, he basically surrendered his autonomy in his own country. He is now Putin's creature and has been for some time. What I don't know is whether Lukashenko will insist on the Belarusian military going into Ukraine in a big way. Stories about that are mixed, but I've heard persistent, though I can't swear to them, persistent stories that the Belarusian soldiers really don't want to go into Ukraine and that they've threatened, to revolt if they're forced to. I don't know whether this is true, but Putin owns Lukashenko. That's clear. The Russian military is unlikely to leave Belarus ever. So it's done. And the Belarusian opposition is, the leadership is largely in exile out of the country and crushed at home, but it exists. And what I've told the Belarusians, at least before the war in Ukraine, is that solidarity was also crushed. Poland's solidarity movement was crushed by martial law. Everybody thought it was finished, but 8 years later, it came back and won. I know they don't want to wait 8 years, but sometimes that's what it takes. We'll see. Anyway, I wish we could go on. These are great questions, and I'm sorry, but you've got a great schedule of people. I'm delighted to be able to participate. And in my day, University of Michigan had one of the world's best Soviet studies program, and that tradition is obviously being maintained. And I think it's just great. So well done.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Fried, for taking time in your very busy schedule to be with us, with our students. And we hope you can pop in during the day as we continue our discussion.